What if I told you Amish farmers dry 2 tons of grain every harvest without a single electric dryer? No fans, no heaters, just air, sun, and time. The methods predate electricity by centuries. Here is how it works from field to winter storage. Harvest timing. The process begins with timing. Amish farmers do not wait for grain to dry completely in the field. They cut wheat and oats when the kernels have reached what farmers call the hard dough stage. The grain is mature enough to harvest but still contains moisture between 17 and 25%. Harvesting at this stage prevents shattering, where dry grain falls from the stalks before it can be collected. It also allows the grain to finish drying after harvest without losing quality. Modern farmers with electric dryers can harvest wetter grain. Amish farmers must harvest at the right moisture level for their drying method. Shocking in rows. Once grain is cut, it must be formed into shocks. A shock is a bundle of grain sheaves stood upright in the field to allow air circulation. The cutting process uses a horse-drawn binder that cuts the grain stalks and ties them into bundles called sheaves. These sheaves drop onto the field in rows. Family members follow behind the binder, gathering 6 to 8 sheaves and standing them together in a teepee formation. The last sheaf is placed on top like a cap to shed rain and protect the grain heads from weather and birds. Each shock stands about 4 feet tall. A 10-acre wheat field might contain 300 to 400 shocks arranged in neat rows across the stubble. The work is physically demanding and involves everyone old enough to lift a sheaf. Field drying period. The shocks stand in the field for 2 to 3 weeks. During this time, wind and sun gradually reduce the moisture content of the grain. The teepee shape allows air to flow through the center of the shock while the outer sheaves protect the inner ones from rain. On sunny days with low humidity, grain can lose 1/4 to 1/2% moisture per day. On humid or rainy days, drying slows or stops entirely. The farmer checks the shocks regularly, watching for signs that rain has penetrated too deeply or that grain heads are sprouting from excessive moisture. If a shock tips over in wind, it must be stood back up immediately or the grain touching the ground will mold. The field becomes a landscape of golden shocks, standing like small sentinels waiting for collection day. Children are taught to walk carefully between the rows to avoid knocking shocks over during this critical drying period. Collection day. When the grain has dried sufficiently in the shocks, collection day arrives. This typically happens 2 to 3 weeks after shocking, depending on weather conditions. The farmer tests the grain by biting a kernel. If it cracks cleanly without feeling rubbery, it is dry enough to thresh. If it still bends or feels soft, the shocks must stand longer. On collection day, wagons move through the field. Workers load the shocks onto the wagons, stacking them carefully to fit as many as possible without losing sheaves during transport. A single wagon can hold 30 to 40 shocks depending on size. The loaded wagons are pulled by draft horses to the barn where threshing will take place. Some families thresh immediately. Others stack the shocks in the barn to wait for a community threshing day when neighbors gather to help process everyone's grain at once. The shocks are built into larger stacks inside the barn, arranged to allow continued air circulation until threshing begins. This indoor storage protects the grain from any additional rain while it waits to be threshed. Threshing process. Threshing separates the grain kernels from the stalks and chaff. Modern Amish communities use mechanical threshers powered by diesel engines or hydraulic systems rather than electric motors. The thresher is a large machine with a rotating drum covered in metal teeth. Sheaves are fed into the thresher, where the drum beats the grain loose from the stalks. The grain falls through screens while the straw is blown out the back. The separated grain flows into a wagon or directly into storage bins. A good thresher can process several tons of grain per day when properly fed. Threshing is community work. Multiple families gather to help each other process their harvests. Men feed sheaves into the thresher. Boys haul away straw. Women prepare large meals for the work crew. The work is hot, dusty, and loud. Chaff fills the air and coats everyone's clothes and skin, but it is also fast compared to the weeks of field drying that preceded it. By the end of threshing day, thousands of pounds of loose grain have been separated from the stalks and are ready for the final drying stage in storage bins. The straw is saved for animal bedding. Nothing is wasted. Barn storage bins. Amish grain storage bins are designed specifically for natural air drying. Unlike sealed commercial bins with electric fans and heaters, Amish bins rely on passive air movement. The bins are typically made of wood or metal and are built inside barns or in separate grain sheds. The floor of the bin is constructed with gaps or perforations that allow air to flow up from below. Some bins have slatted wooden floors with spaces between the boards. Others use metal mesh screens. The key is that air can enter from the bottom and move upward through the grain. Vents near the top of the bin allow moist air to escape. The barn itself is designed with large doors and windows that can be opened to create cross-ventilation. On dry, breezy days, the farmer opens the barn to allow maximum airflow through the building and through the grain bins. On humid or rainy days, the barn is closed to prevent moisture from entering. The bin walls are solid to contain the grain, but the structure as a whole promotes air circulation. Some Amish farmers install simple wind-powered ventilators on barn roofs that create negative pressure inside the building, pulling air through the grain bins without any electric fans. The entire system works on the principle that moving air gradually carries moisture away from the grain over time. Layered filling. Grain is not dumped into the storage bin all at once immediately after threshing. Instead, it is added in layers over several days or weeks. This technique, called layer filling, dramatically improves natural air drying. The first layer of grain, typically 2 to 4 feet deep, is placed in the bin and left to dry for several days. Air moves through this shallow layer more easily than it would through a full bin. As the bottom layer dries, another layer is added on top. The process repeats until the bin is full or the harvest is complete. Each layer receives good airflow during its initial days in the bin when it is wettest and most likely to spoil. Layer filling also allows farmers to harvest and thresh over an extended period without waiting for the entire bin to dry before adding more grain. The surface of each layer is kept level. Grain that cones up in the center creates uneven airflow and can lead to spoilage in the peak. Workers use shovels or grain scoops to spread the grain evenly after it is poured into the bin. Some farmers mark the bin walls at specific heights to track how much grain has been added and ensure each layer is the planned thickness. The gradual filling process takes patience, but it prevents the wet grain at the top of a full bin from spoiling before air can dry it. Moisture testing. Amish farmers monitor grain moisture using methods that do not require electric meters. The simplest test is the bite test. A farmer takes a kernel, places it between his back teeth, and bites down. Properly dried grain cracks cleanly with a sharp sound. Wet grain compresses without breaking or feels rubbery. This method requires experience to interpret correctly, but it works. Another test involves shaking a handful of grain in a jar. Dry grain makes a rattling sound and flows freely. Damp grain clumps and sounds muffled. Some farmers use a simple hand twist test where they squeeze a handful of grain tightly. If the grain springs apart when the hand opens, it is dry enough. If it stays compressed in the shape of the hand, it is still too wet. More precise testing can be done by weighing grain samples before and after drying them in a warm oven, then calculating the moisture percentage from the weight loss. This requires no electricity, just a scale, an oven heated by wood or propane, and basic math. The farmer tests grain from different depths in the bin because the top layer stays wetter longer than the bottom. If the top grain tests dry, the entire bin is ready for long-term storage. If the top is still damp, the grain needs more time. These manual testing methods have been refined over generations and work reliably when performed by experienced hands. Winter monitoring. Drying does not stop once the bin is full. Throughout fall and winter, the farmer continues monitoring the stored grain for signs of trouble. Temperature changes inside the bin indicate problems. Grain naturally generates some heat through respiration even after it is harvested. If this heat builds up without ventilation, it can trigger mold growth or insect activity. The farmer uses a long metal probe inserted deep into the grain to check temperature at different levels. If the probe comes out warm to the touch, something is wrong. The grain may need to be stirred to distribute heat or moved to another bin to prevent spoilage. Moisture migration is another concern. As outside temperatures drop in winter, warm, moist air inside the grain can rise and condense on the colder grain near the top of the bin. This creates wet spots that can mold. On cold, dry days, farmers open barn doors and vents to equalize temperatures and remove moisture. Some farmers shovel grain from the top of the bin and move it to the bottom several times during winter to prevent crusting and distribute any remaining moisture evenly. This manual stirring is hard work, but it prevents losses. Insect inspection also happens regularly. Grain beetles and weevils can infest stored grain if conditions are right. The farmer looks for adult insects crawling on the grain surface and checks for webbing or clumping that indicates insect damage. Early detection allows treatment before the infestation spreads through the entire bin. Spring usage. By spring, properly dried and monitored grain is ready for use. Some grain is ground into flour for the family's bread and baking needs. Amish households use hand-cranked or diesel-powered grain mills to grind wheat into fresh flour as needed. Grinding small batches frequently ensures the flour is always fresh and nutritious. Some grain is saved as seed for the next planting season. The farmer selects the best kernels from the top of the bin where grain dried most slowly and maintained the best quality. This seed is stored separately in clean bags or barrels until spring planting. Some grain is fed to livestock. Chickens receive whole grain or cracked corn. Dairy cows get ground grain mixed with hay. Draft horses eat oats for energy during heavy work periods. The grain that was carefully dried over months now sustains both family and animals through the year. Any surplus grain is sold. Amish farmers take grain to local mills or grain elevators where it is weighed and sold by the bushel. The money from grain sales provides cash income for property taxes, medical expenses, and purchases that cannot be made or grown at home. The selling price for naturally dried grain is sometimes higher than for grain dried with high heat because it has less damage and better quality. Mills that produce specialty flours or organic products prefer grain that was dried slowly without chemical treatments. A farmer who started with wet grain in the field in July might sell the last of that harvest in May, nearly a year later. The entire cycle from cutting to selling required no electricity, just knowledge, labor, and time. Drying 2 tons of grain without electricity is not impossible. It is simply slow. The Amish method relies on principles that farmers understood long before electric dryers existed. Air movement removes moisture. Sun and wind provide the energy. Time allows the process to work without forcing it. The system has weaknesses. Weather can delay drying and ruin grain if rain soaks shocks before they dry. Monitoring requires daily attention and experience to prevent spoilage. The labor demands are significant compared to simply running an electric dryer for a few hours. But the Amish method also has advantages that electric drying cannot match. Natural air drying produces higher quality grain with less kernel damage. It costs nothing in electricity or fuel. It works independently of power grids and fuel supplies. The knowledge required to dry grain naturally is knowledge that builds farming skill rather than dependence on machinery. A young Amish man who learns to judge grain moisture by feel and manage storage bins through winter has learned skills he can use for life. A farmer who relies on electric dryers has learned to operate equipment that will eventually break and need replacement. The Amish recognize this difference. They are not opposed to drying grain efficiently. They are opposed to dependence on systems outside their control. So they shock their wheat in rows across summer fields. They fill bins gradually and monitor moisture by hand. They open barn vents on dry days and stir grain on cold mornings. And every spring, they have dry grain stored without ever flipping a switch. The methods are old, but they still work. That is all that matters.